We are province-wide this morning, and people around the world are mourning the deaths of hundreds of people. Nearly 300 people confirmed dead so far in Sri Lanka. This Easter Sunday bombing killed nearly 300 people, wounded up to 500. Now, police have arrested at least 24 people in a series of raids, and the tragedy comes at a time of year considered significant to people from many religious faiths. Passover, of course, began on Friday. Today is Easter Monday. Ramadan is just a few weeks away. The attacks in Sri Lanka have left many people wondering how you make any sense at all of what is, by all accounts, a senseless tragedy. And for their thoughts, we have convened our panel of religious leaders. Muhammad Shujaath Ali is the Imam and resident scholar at the Al-Haq Mosque in Vancouver. That's part of the BC Muslim Association. Melissa Skelton is the Anglican Archbishop of the Diocese of New Westminster. And Dan Moskovitz is a senior rabbi of Temple Shalom in Vancouver. And good morning to all three of you.
Good morning,
Good
Sarah.
morning.
Good morning.
I want to begin with an excerpt from an interview that we had earlier today on the show. Angela Nalia lives in Vancouver. She used to live in Colombo in Sri Lanka, where she attended St. Anthony's Church, which was one of the churches that was attacked over the weekend. Just have a listen.
It's a very, very powerful church, and it's heartbreaking for me to see all those video clips that I received yesterday, and it's brought back a lot of memories, and it's very, very sad.
What went through your mind? I mean, when you heard specifically that was one of the churches that was attacked, what went through your mind?
I said, where is God,
So there's a question, where is God when something like this happens? Rabbi Moskovitz, do you have an answer to that?
Well, I wouldn't begin to speak for God, but I think that God is in mourning as well. We're coming, as you mentioned, just on the heels of the first two Passover meals or seders. And during those rituals, we take the wine cup, which is the symbol of joy and liberation and freedom of the ancient Israelite slaves, and we place it in the center of our table, and we dip out some of the wine, drops of wine for each of the 10 plagues, remembering the suffering of the Egyptians that also occurred during the plagues in the midst of the freedom. And we do that because we're told in the stories that God is crying also, that God celebrates the liberation of people into freedom, the Israelites from slavery, but at the same time it is also God's creation, the Egyptians that are suffering as the walls of the waters of the Red Sea crash upon them. And so we pour out some of our joy to remember the sadness in that. And I think that God is in those tears.
Imam Muhammad, how would you answer that question if someone were to ask you in light of what's happened?
I would say in light of my own tradition and the understanding of the faith, there are a number of quotations from the Holy Quran. They somehow shed light on this whole idea of the existence of God and God being with people and being with them in their times and difficulties and situations. وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ is one of the verses of the Holy Quran that says God is with you wherever you are. And in our tradition, we have, in fact, a statement of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that states that God has literally given every soul some angels to guard and protect. In addition to both of these facts, there is a relative human free will and freedom of choice. And it is the exercise of those freedom of will and choice oftentimes bring about these types of heinous crimes and atrocities. And no doubt that definitely it is condemned by the religion and the divine plan. But to us, it is the abuse of that freedom of will and choice that brings about these types of, atrocities on human societies.
Archbishop Skelton, for you, how would you answer that question?
Well, I honestly, when you asked or quoted that, Stephen, I had to give some pause to that because it is the question that rises up in my heart. Jesus on the cross, is said in some accounts to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I take it seriously, that question seriously, and I would so agree with what's already been said, and all that I can say, and I'll quote our own dean at Peter Elliott at Christ Church Cathedral for his Easter sermon, that the horrific, violent events that happened in the world are not the last word. That life, through the power of God, will have the last word. That's what I hold on to.
Rabbi Moskovitz, Sri Lanka's defense minister has described the bombings as a terrorist attack by religious extremists. What would you say to people who say that religion is at the heart of so many of these attacks?
Well, I don't think it's religion that's at the heart of those attacks. It's the ill practice of religion. I once saw a billboard actually outside a church that once said that if your religion tells you to kill other people, you're doing it wrong. And I think that if this is religious extremism at work here, as it has been in Christ Church, perhaps, or as well, that it's the ill application of the tenets of religion. We have to look at how religion is intended to help us recognize the humanity in other, and not the other in other. Mm-hmm. Going back to the story of Passover again, we see that there's this fear of otherness that takes place in biblical Egypt, that the Hebrew slaves are rising up in number, and so those that are in the current power structures are fearful of that. And I think that we are seeing that replicate itself throughout history, and certainly today. And I think that leaders like you have here on the panel and my colleagues across faith traditions, we're not teaching hate. We're teaching understanding and tolerance, and panels like this are important as part of that dialogue to recognize that there's so much more that brings us together as people of faith than it is that separates us.
Imam Muhammad, last month we were talking about the tragedy in New Zealand where 50 people were killed at shootings in two mosques in Christchurch. I mean, extremism, whether it's based in religion or ideology, I mean, it doesn't seem to know any boundaries. What happens if people are afraid to gather in their places of worship, knowing that they are targets?
Stephen, it is indeed a very serious concern to our community, in particular, and in general, in faith community. What concerns me the most, the rise of this trend. Up until recent time, it used to be the civilians being targeted in the street and whatnot. The rise of this trend where not only the civilians and innocent individuals, rather the worship itself, worshippers, and sacred moments, in fact, being basically being targeted in this regard. And to be honest, this fear indeed has affected many of our congregations, members of our congregation. Therefore, we had to reach out to the law enforcement. But one of the things that I said to my congregation, regardless of what happens and regardless of what has been happening all over the world, the percentage of such evil individuals is very minute, not even 1%. And our religious tradition itself shows that whenever the religion has gone through phases such as these ones, it has come out as victorious at the end. The life of Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, was the subject of, according to our tradition, 13 assassination attempts. But at the end of the day, who won? So that's what this shows the rise of hope and the horizon of hope that we continue to look up to.
And Archbishop Skelton, how do you talk to your congregation about the violence that we have seen directed specifically at people of faith over the past few months?
I mean, I would so agree with Rabbi Dan. We first fundamentally we talk about at the heart of what we are is peace, is compassion, is understanding of people whose religious traditions we don't share, is at the heart of who we are, are these things. We mourn them, and for us, Holy Week is all about religious violence that turns to something else. Mm-hmm. So we've just come off of a week where we in the middle of the week we did something called the blanket exercise about violence directed to indigenous peoples and the lament around that. The walking the steps with Jesus is all about that. So at the very heart of who we are is this question, and is our affirmation that we not only are not about that, life will be generated by God after that.
We are going to continue this conversation in just a moment. Very happy to have our faith panel with us this morning on the early edition, and we are province-wide. And Amy Bell's got your traffic and weather.
Traffic really not an issue this morning. We're still looking good for all the major routes, clearing that stall off the Alex Fraser. Where it is getting busier, though, it was at the borders and at the ferries. 10 minutes or less right now at the borders, but at the ferries we have that one cell wait from Langdale to Horseshoe Bay and also Departure Bay to Horseshoe Bay. And looking at rain for the most part today, but we will start to dry up a bit this afternoon. Back with more before the 8:30 news.
Thank you, Amy. Mohammed Shujaath Ali is the Imam and resident scholar at the Al-Haq Mosque in Vancouver. Dan Moskovitz, Senior Rabbi of Temple Shalom in Vancouver, both of them with us in studio. Melissa Skelton is the Anglican Archbishop of the Diocese of New Westminster, and she joins us on the line. Together they are our faith panel. And back to you, Archbishop Skelton, if I could. We've seen, of course, what happened in Sri Lanka over the weekend. We've mentioned what happened in New Zealand as well. In some cases, these attacks happen in the name of religion. We've heard Rabbi Dan's explanation, which is if your religion tells you to kill people, you're doing it wrong. But what do you say to people who see events like this and are just disillusioned with religion altogether of any faith?
Honestly, my own contact is of a different sort. I don't get that very much. I myself ask myself that a lot, and as I look at what happens around the world, I see it as religion used to reflect cultural, racial, economic bias, and the call to want to go to conflict related to that. I don't see it as at the heart of religion. I see it as quite different. But I do think people use religions as a way to kind of give righteousness to those attitudes. And so that's what I tell myself, and when it comes up, that's what I tell people. What I experience is this last week we had more people earnestly seeking a spiritual life that is all about the things we've just talked about than ever before in our city of Vancouver, out of our cathedral. So they are coming to us for an ability to voice these things, struggle with these things, and find a different way.
I just want to share with you a comment that just popped up on Twitter, and it's to do with the first question I asked or was asked by one of our guests, which is, where is God when something like this happens? He writes, at first thought, that makes sense, but if God is omniscient, he's known about every atrocity since before the beginning of time. If God is omnipotent, he could have prevented all of them. How do you answer that?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you for giving me that great theological question to answer in 30 seconds or less. Everybody has their own view and role of God in the world. Mine is that God does not inject God's self into the daily life of human beings, but is there for us in the midst of our trials and our challenges, our triumphs and our celebrations. So God is a place that I can go to find greater meaning and understanding, to put into context all that's happening in the world. But it's upon me and in my hands to make this heaven on earth, not hell on earth for others. And that then when we speak about bringing about a messianic age, it's not waiting for a Messiah to come, but I have to be the help that I'm praying for. So where is God in this? God is inspiring me to not allow this to happen in this community here, or to do my part that I can with my congregation and others around the world to lower those feelings of violence and otherness and hatred. Just one very brief thing I would say is that in our synagogues we're commanded to build them with windows so that we're aware of the world around us as we pray. It's incumbent upon us as faith leaders to not just silo ourselves and not just focus on the needs of our particular congregation, but to not separate ourselves from the community, and to do things like this, to have that interfaith dialogue and to have that shared sense of purpose to bring about healing and understanding in our world.
Imam Muhammad, would you like to add something there?
Yes, indeed. What I would like to say, going back to my earlier comment, it is quite clear in our faith tradition that God indeed is omnipresent and whatnot. But on the other hand, this world, as we view it, is a place of test and trial. So though God is well aware of what has been happening in the world, but he also has given a relative freedom to everyone to choose and act as they wish. And based on their actions, God will judge whether or not they were a responsible being in this world and a proper representative and vicegerent of God on the face of the earth. Therefore, to us, this life here is not fully dictated by God. You have the dictates of God, but then you have a free will and freedom of choice to apply it or not to apply it. It's a choice of a human being. And this is where we see that though the knowledge of God is there and the decision of God is there, on the other hand, the freedom that human beings have been given, they are abusing that. And they will be responsible for that on the day of judgment.
Rabbi Skelton, last word to you.
Oh, thank you. I'd love being rabbi.
Oh, sorry, Rabbi. I'm sorry. Pardon me, Archbishop Skelton. I have just converted you.
Can I have your parking space?
So I would so agree about what has already been said about human action. Again, in the Christian tradition, God's very self was the object of that violence. So that helps us relocate the power of God, that God chose, in a sense, powerlessness, human contingency, human suffering as a road to another place. So that is so much right at the heart of what we've just celebrated.
Well, I'm very glad to demonstrate human fallibility for all of you this morning as well. Thank you so much. It's such a great conversation, and we appreciate you coming together like this so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Mohammed Shujaath Ali is the Imam and resident scholar at Al-Haq Mosque and the BC Muslim Association in Vancouver. Melissa Skelton, Anglican Archbishop. Archbishop she is, of the Diocese of New Westminster. Dan Moskovitz is the rabbi. He's the senior rabbi of Temple Shalom here in Vancouver.